This is the guide to reading and annotating Act 3 of All My Sons. And so just as you did with the other videos, you need to read the play in sections, pause the video as you read, then restart the video and annotate the text as I talk you through the annotations. Please make sure that you note down more than just copying what's already been written on here. Otherwise, you're not really making full use of the audio commentary. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than just read out the annotations. So you need to make sure you're copying that down. So the first part that you need to read begins on page 1 of the PDF, which is page 73 in your text, and goes through Act 1 down to the arrival or the entrance of Anne here on page 78. So I'd like you to now pause the video and read from the beginning of Act 3 to the entrance of Anne on page 78. Remember just to read and highlight anything you think is significant, important, or interesting as you read, and then we'll go through it together when you're ready to. So pause the video now, please, and then read that section. So the first thing to note is that Act 3 is significantly shorter than Act 1 and Act 2. So this is the dramatic climax of the play, where the events are all going to come together. And it's important to note that it's much shorter at this section of the play. The first thing to note as well is that it's 2:00 the following morning, as it says here. So it's nighttime essentially, and the entire action of the play takes less than 24 hours. And so what you have as the scene opens in Act 3 is Mother on the stage, and she is discovered on the rise, rocking ceaselessly in a chair. So she is clearly in a distressed state of mind here. And you can see that she's anxious and she's worried at this moment. Of course, at the end, what we know is that Chris has left at the end following the revelation of Joe's guilt. So she is sitting anxiously worrying, waiting for him. And Jim arrives here to ask whether or not there's been any news from Chris. And interestingly, his exchange here reminds us again of the importance of money. So he's been called out to see some patients, and he talks about money. And this importance again that in this society, money is important to the characters. And there's another reminder there of that at the beginning of Act 3. So if we go down to the next page, what we have here again is the role of Jim further developed in Act 3 when he says to Kate, "Don't be afraid, Kate. I know. I've always known." And it becomes clear here that Jim has always known about Joe's guilt. And again, it's that idea that we have explored earlier in the play, that there are things that people know that are unsaid in this play. And this is a good example of it here. And Mother even suggests that she thinks Chris actually knew. He had that feeling in the back of his head. Chris almost knew. It's this idea that the characters were unwilling to face the reality and the truth of what Joe had done here. And that's important. He talks here, Jim, about an alternate, like a time in his life where he says, "One year I simply took off and went to New Orleans." Nice little connection there with Streetcar. And he went off for 2 months, and I lived on bananas and milk and studied a certain disease. It was beautiful. So this idea that he had this moment in his life where he didn't have responsibilities and expectations for him. But then his wife came back and brought him back, and he says, "I can't find myself. It's even hard sometimes to remember the kind of man I wanted to be." That, he's now a man with responsibilities, similarly really to Joe as well. And he's got family responsibilities now. So Joe arrives then in the scene at this moment, and he's in his dressing gown and slippers. It's obviously the middle of the night. And he is immediately upset and anxious that when he realizes that Jim knows. So he says, "How does he know?" And then later, Mother's concern reinforces that Anne knows as well. And again, he asks another question. She doesn't know, does she? He is very concerned about other people's perceptions of him and very worried about it. And then down towards the bottom of this page, it's significant that he says, "What happened to my family?" And remember that this idea of family is so important to Joe, and it reinforces that that's part of his core values. So on the next page, if we scroll down to here on the next page, this exchange between Mother and Joe, she says to him, I mean, you ought to make it clear to him that you know you did a terrible thing. So she's trying to build bridges and put right the destruction of the relationship between Joe and Chris. And she suggests that what Joe should do is to tell Chris that he's willing to go to prison here. And so she's trying to put this situation right, to right a wrong that's been done there, and to build a bridge between father and son. And Joe is saying here, like, when Mother says maybe he would forgive you, he would forgive me for what? So Joe is still not really accepting his responsibility here, and he's still not facing up to what he's done. And when there's this sort of mention about money again, and Joe says, you wanted money, so I made money. What must I be forgiven? This idea that he's provided for his family is very important to Joe. He says, I spoiled the both of you. I should have put him out when he was 10, like I was put out, and made him earn his keep. So this idea that Joe is somebody who has worked his way up in the world of business and has bettered himself through financial gain and business success is very important to him. And this conversation carries on onto the next page. And Mother says there's something bigger than family to him. And this is quite important because this is an important concept in the play. And it was mentioned at the end of Act 2, if you remember, that Chris sees that an individual has responsibility to the world beyond their immediate family. And to Joe, Joe just doesn't believe that when he says nothing is bigger here. He doesn't believe that anything is bigger or more important than your immediate family. And he says, I'm his father, he's my son. And if there's something bigger than that, then I'll put a bullet in my head. So this sort of confidence that he says there, but obviously, as you've watched the rest of the play, there is some irony to his statement there and his threat that he will put a bullet in his head if he understands that there is more to life than family, because he's not willing to really accept that. If we go a bit further down here, he starts to talk about Larry, and I think it's an interesting technique being used by Arthur Miller just to remind the audience about Larry and about the grief that Keller and Mother have suffered with the loss of Larry. So he talks about Larry, that was the boy we lost, Larry, and this sense of sadness that Joe and Kate have over the loss and death of Larry. And again, at the end of this section that you're reading here, he reasserts again, for you, Kate, for both of you, that's all I ever lived for. So this is what he's been acting in the interests of his family. You know, this is what drives Joe forward, is trying to provide for his family. So pause the video again now at this point, and what I'd like you to do is to read from this point of Anne's arrival in the scene right to the end of Act 3. So this will take you to the end of the play. So again, just read it, enjoy reading it, see the revelation and the resolution to this drama that we've been reading. And as you read it, just highlight, annotate, underline anything you think is significant, important, or interesting. Then when you're ready, restart the video and we'll go through the annotations together. So a very dramatic end to All My Sons, as I'm sure you've just read. So let's go through this together. So Anne back on the stage at this point, and what she's trying to do here is to make Kate face up to the truth. And she says here, I'd like you to tell him that Larry is dead and that you know it. You understand me. I'm not going out of here alone. So she has now heard the truth that her father was innocent, or that Joe was at least also guilty, and allowed her father to take the blame. But what she really wants here, she says, I do nothing about Joe. She said, she's not here to punish Joe, but what she wants is to move forward from this. And so she wants Kate to face up to the truth that Larry is dead. She repeats down here, you had 2 sons, but you've only got 1 now. And she wants Mother to accept this. And again, even in this late part of the play in Act 3, Kate is refusing to acknowledge that. To his dying day, he'll wait for his brother. So he says, that's referring to Chris, of course, that Chris will not accept that his brother is dead. And Anne just keeps repeating, Larry is dead, Kate. I said, he's dead. I know. He crashed off the coast of China, November 25th. His engine didn't fail him, but he died. I know. So what we're finding out here is that Anne knows, again, more than she's letting on at the very beginning of the play. She's another character who has secrets here that are being revealed at this point. And she knows more information about Larry's death than the other characters here. And what she's interesting about Anne here is that she doesn't really want to share the truth. She doesn't want to do it because she doesn't really want to hurt Kate and Joe, actually, at this point. She would rather not have to reveal what she knows. And she says, I loved him. You know, I loved him. I would have looked at anyone else if I wasn't sure. That's enough for you. So she's saying you should accept the fact that I know that Larry is dead. And these stage directions are interesting when Mother's moving on her and she grasps Anne's wrists, the desperation and the panic in Kate here as she's starting to be forced to acknowledge the fact that Larry is dead. And what happens is that Anne presents her with this letter, and that's important. She says she sees Anne take a letter from her pocket. And this letter, obviously, Anne's been holding on to for a long time. And it's a letter that Larry wrote to her just before he flew out on his final mission. And what's interesting dramatically here is that Arthur Miller has Anne give the letter to Mother, and Mother reads the letter, but the audience still don't know what's in that letter. So we hear Anne talking about the letter, saying, he wrote to me just before, that she's not trying to hurt Kate. You see the broken dialogue here reflecting that this is quite a difficult conversation for Anne to have with Kate. And the stage directions there really showing the drama and the dramatic tension of Kate's reaction to the letter. A long, low moan comes from Mother's throat as she reads. And if you go back and watch that production of All My Sons that I asked you to watch, it's so powerful to watch that moment where Kate reads the letter and is confronted with the truth of Larry's death. And it's such a dramatic moment for the audience as well, because we still don't know, and it makes us keen to know what's happening, what has actually happened, what's the truth here. So I think that's quite important, the symbolism of the letter that represents the truth of Larry's death. But still in Act 3, the drama's being escalated, really, or the tensions being escalated as we wait for it all to be revealed. So then a bit further down on this side, Chris has just come back into the scene then at this point. So he enters from the driveway, it says here. He's coming back in the middle of the night here. And he talks, he says he's going to go away. He's leaving. And he says, I was made yellow in this house because I suspected my father and I did nothing about it. And what he means when he refers to himself being yellow is he means he's been acting like a coward. So again, he's accepting the fact that he did know the truth about Joe and he didn't do anything about it. He allowed that lie to be in existence for as long as it has. He hasn't confronted it. And there's this exchange between Anne and Chris where Anne clearly wants to go with Chris, but he suggests that Anne will never really truly forgive him. And he says, in your heart, you always will. You'll always want to do something about Joe, and that they can't have a future together because of this. And it's interesting, Chris's line here where he says, do I raise the dead when I put him behind bars? Then what'll I do for it? We shoot a man who acted like a dog, but honor was real there, and you're protecting something. But here, this is the land of the great big dogs, and don't love a man here, you eat him. So this idea of like destroying somebody here is what he's talking about. And Anne says, you know what he's got to do, tell him. And what he's referring to here, what Anne's referring to, is she's asking Mother to tell Chris the truth, to reveal what she's just read in that letter that the audience still don't know and still haven't had the information about. But there's again another desperate attempt really here to tell Chris the truth. And what you get is Keller's anger here, as Chris suggests that there's this sort of suggestion when, Keller says, what do you want me to do here? And it's not what I want you to do, it's what you want to do. And Keller's anger and his ferocity about the suggestion that he should possibly go to jail, that he should give himself up. And he says, who worked for nothing during that war. So he's saying everybody was cutting corners in the war. He said, did they ship a gun or a truck out of Detroit before they got their price? Is that clean? It's dollars and cents, nickels and dimes. War and peace, it's nickels and dimes. What's clean? Half the goddamn country is got to go if I go. So he's saying, there were so many people behaving in a way that wasn't morally right and making choices for their own good here. And again, that use of monologue is interesting here because it's representing Joe's desperation at this stage when he's saying, how do you want to punish me? Why should I do this? And he says, and this line I think is so important from Chris when he says, I know you're no worse than most men, but I thought you were better. I never saw you as a man. I saw you as my father. So this is so important because it's Chris looks up to Joe. And he's saying here, I don't care if everybody else was doing it. I had higher expectations of you because you're my father. And he's unable to even look at Keller. And if you think about the importance of what Joe said just a couple of pages before when he said, if there's something more important than family, I'll put a bullet in my head here. And what he's discovering here is that to Chris, there are things that are more important than that. And he feels very let down by his father at this point. And then what happens is that Anne goes quickly to Mother. She takes the letter from her and she heads over to give the letter to Chris. And Mother is absolutely desperate for Chris not to read it. And Anne insists that Chris reads Larry's letter. And it's interesting, Mother, again, is still in that protective maternal role here as she tries to stop Chris from hearing the truth. And she tries to even protect Joe from hearing the truth here at this point. She tries to send Joe away. Go to the street, Joe. Don't, Chris. She's pleading from her whole soul in the stage directions there, desperately trying to avoid them reading what's in this letter. And again, that exchange is just such a brilliant device used by Arthur Miller to build up the tension for the audience, because the more that Kate tries to stop Joe and Chris from hearing what's in the letter, the more we want to hear what's in the letter, and we need to hear the truth in the same way that the characters do. This is an interesting line from Keller. It says, Chris, a man can't be a Jesus in this world. And he's mentioned that earlier, I think in Act 1, this idea that, that perfection isn't possible, isn't a realistic goal to aim for, that Joe says here. And then in response to that, Chris reads the letter. So the letter here says, my dear Anne, it's impossible to put down the things I feel, but I've got to tell you something. Yesterday, they flew in a load of papers from the States and I read about Dad and your father being convicted. I can't express myself. I can't tell you how I feel. I can't bear to live anymore. Last night, I circled the base for 20 minutes before I could bring myself in. How could he have done that? Every day, 3 or 4 men never come back and he sits back there doing business. I don't know how to tell you what I feel. I can't face anybody. I'm going out on a mission in a few minutes. They'll probably report me missing. If they do, I want you to know that you mustn't wait for me. I'll tell you, Anne, if I had him here now, I could kill him. And that's so important, because this is the revelation in the play that Larry knew that Joe had shipped out those cracked cylinder heads. He knew that it was Joe's fault as well as Anne's father's fault. And as a result of that, he died by suicide. As he says here, they will report me as missing, which is exactly what they did. But he has purposefully crashed his plane and died because he cannot face his father here. He says that I can't bear to live anymore, knowing what his father's done. So he's reinforcing Chris's statement about how let down he feels by his father at this point. And you can see the drama of Keller's reaction as he grabs the letter from Chris's hand and reads it. And Chris says, now blame the world. Do you understand that letter? So it's at that moment that Keller realizes what he's done. And he says, get the car, I'll put on my jacket. So the implication is that he's going to turn himself in. He's going to go to the police. He's going to confess what he did at this point. And this, of course, is one of the most important lines in the whole play. When looking at the letter and realizing what he's done, he says, sure, he was my son, but I think to him they were all my sons. And I guess they were. This idea that those other men who died in the war, the men who died as a result of the cracked cylinder heads that Joe shipped out, he had a responsibility to them in the same way that he has a responsibility to his own son, and that he has a responsibility to the wider world here, which is what he's resisted the whole way through this play, and maintained that family is the most important thing. But he's coming to that realization that there is more in the world that's important to that, and that this idea that they were sort of symbolically all his sons here. And that's definitely the attitude that Chris and Larry had in the play, when Chris talked about the other men that had died in war with him when he was enlisted in the war. And Larry, obviously, when he says up here that every day, he says, where does he say? Every day, 3 or 4 men never come back, and he sits there doing business. Larry is equating the men that don't come back, who go out to battle in war, in the army or the air force, as, you know, their lives are just as valuable as Larry's is. And Joe is realizing here at this point that he had a responsibility to them as well. Mother, still to the end, resists Joe turning himself in, and Chris says, "I'm taking him." So the idea that they are going to go to the police, they are going to confess that Joe was responsible for this. And Chris is absolutely determined to do it. And Mother says, "The war is over. Didn't you hear? It's over." So he's saying, it doesn't matter. This is all in the past. Then what was Larry to you? A stone that fell in the water. It's not enough for him to be sorry. Larry didn't kill himself to make you and Dad sorry. It's so important. And he says to his mother, "You can be better. Once and for all, you can all know there's a universe of people outside and you're responsible to it. And unless you know that, you threw away your son because that's why he died." And that's a really central message in the play. And it's actually quite a universal theme in many of Arthur Miller's works, this idea about social responsibility, and responsibility to the world outside your own immediate circle. And this is Chris's final message. And what's significant is that as soon as he delivers that line, a shot is heard in the house. And if you remember, the gun was mentioned in Act 1 at the beginning of the play. And obviously that is a significant mention, because it's important later in the play that we know that Joe had a gun, and that Joe has died now, that he has died by suicide at the end of the play and shot himself. So Chris says immediately he's obviously sad because his father's died, and they're if you look at the emotions here, Mother is almost moaning, Chris is almost crying, and Mother's last lines, I think, are really important and significant. "Don't, dear, don't take it on yourself. Forget now, live." This idea that they're going to move forward from this, but is this an example of Kate falling back into delusion at the end of the play and refusing to accept what's happened here and to address what's happened here? But it's obviously, when you watch it in that production, it's a very quick, dramatic, exciting end to the play. Very important. Imagine the power of that shot when you hear it. It's an important auditory image in the play that really brings it to a dramatic conclusion at the end. And if you think about it in comparison with Oleana, where we have that very visual image of John standing over Carol, and then compare that to the end of Streetcar, where we have Blanche being taken away by the doctor, and then the end of All My Sons with the death of Joe. You've got 3 very interesting endings to the play, which are worth some comparison. And that's the end of All My Sons.